Hi, welcome to this week's edition of PHQ, questions from the personality hacker community. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
And Addison, let's get right to our question today.
Hi, Antonia and Joel. What are the differences and similarities between ENTPs and INTPs? Also, I know that extroversion, in contrast to what most people think, does not always mean social. In the case of an ENTP, it could be expressed towards ideas instead of people. So you can't just say, I like to spend time alone, so I must be an INTP and not an ENTP. How can you tell the difference between an INTP and an ENTP that isn't particularly social? Also, what might an ENTP with Asperger's look like? Would their FE maybe be a 7-year-old instead of a 10-year-old? Feel free to speculate wildly. I'm not really looking for a right or wrong answer, but just some ideas to play with. Kat.
Thanks, Kat, for the question.
Yeah, and I think it's these are really interesting, how to compare and contrast different types, especially when people are looking for ways to profile themselves. And the ENTP INTP split it can be kind of tricky when you're trying to profile yourself or when you're trying to profile somebody else. It can be a little tricky because the types are quite similar, but then there's these ways where they show up dramatically different. And so the differences are usually what people are looking for. As Kat mentioned, she's looking for what is the compare and contrast of these two types. So, of course, I'm going to launch right into the cognitive functions, because the biggest difference between an ENTP and an INTP is their cognitive function stack. Now, what's a cognitive function stack for anybody who this might be their very first podcast? The cognitive function stack for every Myers-Briggs type is the cognitive functions or the mental processes that all of us are using all the time, but each type has a different sequence of how they utilize, interact with, and engage with their mental processes. So both ENTPs and INTPs use the same cognitive functions in their stack, but they have them in different positions, and this changes everything. So for an INTP, their dominant cognitive function, or in the CAR model, which is what we prefer to use, their driver process, is a process called introverted thinking, or what we call accuracy. And then their co-pilot process, or auxiliary process, is called extroverted intuition, or what we call exploration. Then their 10-year-old or tertiary process is introverted sensing, or what we call memory. And their 3-year-old process, or what's technically called their inferior process, is extroverted feeling, or what we call harmony. So driver, accuracy; co-pilot, exploration; 10-year-old memory; 3-year-olds, harmony. Now, if you were listening to that, pause this for a moment, write that down, because we're going to contrast that with an ENTP. An ENTP is using all of the same functions, but they're in different positions. So for an ENTP, the driver process is exploration, and the co-pilot process is accuracy. So if you notice, that's in reverse position from the INTP. Then their 10-year-old process is harmony, and their 3-year-old process is memory. So you've got all the same functions, but in different positions. Now, how is that significant? Well, first of all, your driver process is also what we call your flow state. That means that just by using this process, so activities that call upon the parts of the brain that utilize this process, for an INTP, it's accuracy; for an ENTP, it's exploration. Those are their flow state. So they have a compulsion to use them. They have a compulsion to use the driver process, which is different, meaning an INTP is going to regenerate, rejuvenate, and fill their batteries using the accuracy process, which again is technically called introverted thinking. So anything that gives them some opportunity to be alone, to be deep in thought, to data mine, to collect more information, to see things in terms of systems, and have an opportunity to clean slice information, that's going to be their flow state. So that's why, as an introvert, they have a tendency to spend more time alone, because they're getting their juice from an introverted or an alone activity. Now, an ENTP, on the other hand, is leading with a process that is extroverted intuition, or what we call exploration. And that means they're going to regenerate their batteries by engaging with the outside world. Now, this is different than simply engaging with other people, although people are fascinating. And so an ENTP will seek people out, but they don't have to exclusively seek people out to be extroverted. They can be basically engaged with or messing with their environment in order to regenerate their batteries. They're looking for new patterns. They're looking for a zoom out. They're looking for more and more, almost like taking in as much informational territory as possible. That's different than accuracy. Accuracy wants to drill down deep. It wants to get really, like super surgical, really. Think of accuracy as a massively zoomed in process where you're taking a system and dissecting it and seeing all of its components as close as you possibly can. You're looking for things that other people conflate and a way to separate them and see them clean sliced individual pieces of information. Other people may graft them together, but a person who's using introverted thinking or accuracy is looking for ways to understand them as their own components and then understand how they work as a system. Extroverted intuition, on the other hand, or exploration, is a massively zoomed out process. It's about taking in as much territory as possible and seeing lots of different pattern structures and allowing the environment to basically throw these patterns back at you after you've engaged or messed with the pattern or the environment itself. So these are two totally different processes, and an INTP is going to show their druthers by focusing on and giving attention to introverted thinking. An ENTP is going to show their druthers by giving attention and focusing on extroverted intuition, and that will be their natural state. Now, their co-pilot process, or what we call the growth phase, will be the opposite, right? For an INTP, they grow by using more exploration. So while their natural state is to do a massive deep dive and look for all those pieces of information and see the systems running and separate them and understand what makes logical sense to them, they grow by getting outside of that thinking process and simply getting into pattern exploration, right? Like looking for patterns in the outside world, messing with things, doing activities that they've never done before, getting outside their comfort zone, engaging in things that they've never even thought that they would, travel, etc. So new activities are a massive growth phase for an INTP. Whereas an ENTP is already going to be doing lots of that because that's not a growth phase, that's their natural state. So for them, getting more introverted, having more alone time, doing more deep dive, really trying to figure out what the nuances of information is, what makes logical sense to them, getting into concepts like radical honesty and philosophy and formalized logic and sometimes math. These are the things that will be a growth phase for an ENTP. So if you are an NTP and you're trying to figure out whether or not you're an INTP or an ENTP, ask yourself what gives you natural energy, right? What rejuvenates you, puts you in flow, makes you feel really good. And then ask yourself, where do you see your highest leverage growth? What kinds of activities are you doing where you see yourself really excelling when you do those activities, even though they might not be totally natural to you, even though they might force you out of your comfort zone? For an ENTP, getting inside forces them out of their comfort zone. They're more comfortable in the outside world, regardless of whether or not that has anything to do with people. And an INTP is more comfortable being inside of themselves and asking what makes logical sense to them. So these are really good sort of litmus tests for whether or not you're talking about an ENTP and INTP. Now, obviously, their 3-year-old process is going to come in. That's a blind spot for INTPs. Their 3-year-old process is what we call harmony or extroverted feeling. That means that they're going to have a little less time integrating seamlessly into a culture. It means that things like shared emotional experiences are going to be a little bit more awkward for them. They're not going to just naturally get how to play a crowd. That's going to be something that will grow as they learn to develop that skill, but it's not going to be natural. Whereas an ENTP is going to get that stuff a lot more because that's their 10-year-old process. It might not be one of their greatest strengths, but it's certainly not a blind spot. It's on their conscious awareness. It's on their radar. It's just not something that they maybe naturally possess as a way to seamlessly enter a culture. But what they usually do, ENTPs do, is differentiate themselves and gain great charisma that way. Whereas for an ENTP, their blind spot, their 3-year-old process is memory, or what we call, or what's technically called introverted sensing. So anything that requires infrastructural sameness, anything that requires the mundane, it's not simply that they're not going to like that, it's that it's going to be a blind spot for them. Like they're going to actually possibly have panic attacks when they have to say, go get a new license at the DMV. And I say that from personal experience. Situations like that always send me into the 7th orbit of the sun. I can't even handle, I just go to the DMV and I'm like, I can't even, right? That's an ENTP problem. INTPs might not like it, but it's not going to be something that pushes them so far out of their comfort zone they don't even know how to respond to it. So an INTP using that 10-year-old memory process is going to be a little bit better at dealing with some of the infrastructural things that the world has set up around them. They might hate it. They might want to go anarchistic against it. And yet at the same time, it's not something that just completely blindsides them. So these are some of the ways that you can really tell the difference between the two types, diving into the cognitive functions.
And what Antonia's talking about too here is the mental wiring of the mind. And often when we enter into the world of personality types, we talk about behaviors that come up. And what this does, this goes down a level below that to understand how your mind is learning information, how it's making decisions. So it's getting away from the behaviors of someone like, well, they spend time around people. That must make them an extrovert, or they don't like to spend time around people. That must make them an introvert, or whatever the behavior is. And sometimes that's often an indicator of a type, but really it's about that wiring process, those cognitive functions, and where they're placed in your car that indicates what personality type you're showing up to the world with. Kat asked us to speculate wildly about Asperger's and the 10-year-old position for an ENTP of having Asperger's as their tertiary position as harmony.
Yeah, I always get paranoid when people ask me to talk about Asperger's because I can't seem to say the word without it sounding like ass-burgers. Like, Asperger's? Do you eat them? And I know it's Asperger's, but I can't seem to say it right. So if I sound like I'm talking about a really repugnant form of food, I apologize. I know it's Asperger's. That said, what does an ENTP look like with Asperger's? I don't know. I don't know if I've met a person who's an ENTP that has that form of autism, or it is a form of autism if I understand correctly. And I would imagine that they would probably be a higher energy version of an INTP with the same affliction. It would probably be a lot more loud and aggressive. I would imagine a lot of energy pieces like high intensity would come in there, but I don't know. A lot of things that come along with being a person who has Asperger's, if I'm not mistaken, are things like not really being comfortable around touching. And an ENTP might have difficulty with that just in general. But I haven't noticed that. I've actually noticed that ENTPs are usually, because that harmony process is their 10-year-old, they usually don't have the same social phobias that INTPs have. It's a little bit more on their conscious awareness, and so they generally struggle with that a little bit less. I would imagine they would probably be a little bit more aggressive or assertive with their opinions. They might have a harder time regulating their energy levels or regulating, what they're saying. They might be a little less okay with that harmony process. And I'm not sure. I could speculate wildly, but I don't think I'm familiar enough with with Asperger's and with an ENTP that would have one to be able to speculate wildly. I think I'm out of my depth there.
I think what we can do is make a broader question here, and the question could be, do things in your life, circumstances, environment you grew up in, a condition or something like Asperger's that can, now I'm like nervous about saying this incorrectly now myself. What a horrible word to have to say. Can these influence how developed certain cognitive functions are for you as a person? And I think the answer is yes. I think your environment matters a lot. You might be an ENTP and your harmony process may be developed to the level of a 7-year-old based on circumstances, or it might be a little bit more beyond a 10-year-old, maybe an 11-year-old type. Again, this is speculative talking, but I think what it basically comes down to is, yes, your environment, the conditions you're in, the things that you've been raised with, maybe a condition you have, whether it's a medical condition or the culture you live in, can help develop different parts of your personality. So I think in general terms, things can impact how your cognitive functions are developed in general terms. And I think that's something we can talk to, or we can speak to in general terms.
Yeah, I have a feeling that an ENTP that had Asperger's would probably resemble an INTP quite a bit. So it would be hard to know at that point. I think anytime you're dealing with something that, kind of hijacks your brain and makes it more about, not that somebody who is autistic in any way can't make their life about their life as opposed to the autism, but anytime you're dealing with something like that, it's going to take up a big portion of your mental real estate. So it becomes harder to be able to really tell. This is not at all the situation we're talking about. My sister, who was an ESFJ, she had very severe epilepsy. And in some ways, and this was adult onset, she was about 18 years old when she had her first grand mal seizure. And epilepsy actually ended up taking her out. She ended up dying from an epileptic seizure. And what I noticed is that it was hard to profile her because epilepsy, she was profoundly epileptic. She had to be on a lot of very strong medications. Otherwise, she would have possibly even daily, really hardcore grand mal seizures. And so it hijacked her life. Like, she couldn't drive, and there were a lot of different things. I mean, she had a child, and there was a lot of different situations in which, like, her 5-year-old son would have to be there with her when she had a grand mal seizure. And it just was kind of a messy situation. And she ended up looking more like a perceiver than a judger because she couldn't plan her day. Like, it just removed her ability to control her life. So as an ESFJ, she normally would want to be a lot more in control, a lot more organized, a lot more planned, knowing what's coming up. But this thing just kind of hijacked it. It made it so that she could never fully plan anything. She'd have a grand mal seizure. It would take her out for the rest of the day, or at least hours. So I think whenever you're dealing with something that's a wild card, it is definitely going to impact your type. And if it's serious enough, if it's a serious enough condition, it's definitely going to really alter your relationship with your wiring. It might actually impose its own form of wiring. And remember, Myers-Briggs is just one typology system. It's just one way of understanding how the brain works. There are plenty of other ways to understand how the brain works. And so an ENTP that has Asperger's might look more like an INTP. I'm not sure. It probably would depend upon the individual person, I would imagine, and how it showed up. Like, how severe is it? How much is it taking over? What are their strategies for dealing with the situation? How much mental real estate is it hijacking? So, yeah, conditions definitely impact type, and I would think that would be one situation in which would be highly individualistic as how that shows up.
Thanks, Kat, for the question. If you have been listening and you want to leave a comment or a thought or a question right below this podcast, you can do that over at personalityhacker.com. You can also join our growing community of like minds, facebook.com/personalityhacker or twitter.com/personalityhack. There's people just like you that are there every day talking about personal growth through the lens of understanding your personality, understanding who you are and how you show up to the world, and what you're going to give to the world based on that. So it's a great place to come over. If you like what you hear here and you'd love to subscribe, you can find us on iTunes. You can subscribe to our main podcast and then this PHQ podcast on a weekly basis. We'd love to have you there, and leave a rating. Let us know what you think based on what we're doing here on Personality Hacker. This has been the PHQ questions from the Personality Hacker Community Podcast. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
Can't wait to talk with you on the next episode.